ever get that bill from the doctor's office and you're just like, what in the world, is this even real?
It can be so confusing.
Seriously, one time I got charged extra for like a brief emotional support chat with me. Come on, who isn't a little emotional, doctor? So it turns out there's this whole system for those codes they use. It's called Evaluation and Management Coding, or EM. And it's how medical professionals get paid, for their time, for their expertise. But guess what? Those EM codes, they got a whole makeover for 2021. Big changes.
Including smaller and sometimes vague changes each year since. Yeah, anyone who's involved with medical billing and coding, this is a big deal. We're talking providers, coders, everybody needs to be paying attention. And that's why we are diving deep into the AAPC 2024 EM audit worksheet today. This thing is massive.
Absolutely. It's the resource. It really is like the ultimate cheat sheet, I think, for these new guidelines, right? But I have to admit, even just looking at it, it feels kind of overwhelming.
Exactly. Yeah, I get that. That's why we are here today.
To break it all down. Give everybody like the highlights and, try to make it a little fun along the way. So let's jump right in. What's the biggest change for 2024? When you look at this thing, what's the big shocker?
So EM coding, it's always been about how complex patient care is. And I think these 2024 guidelines are emphasizing that even more.
Because they're putting medical decision-making, or MDM, right up front.
Wow, that's the focus.
Okay, so this MDM shift is kind of a big deal. It's not just about checking boxes anymore. It's more about reflecting the nitty-gritty, a real deal. Okay, so MDM, that's our star player now, but for someone who's actually using this worksheet like a coder, what does that actually look like?
So it means, like you said, moving away from checking boxes and really focusing on why a provider is making the decisions they're making. And the worksheet actually gives a really good example of this with how it defines a stable chronic illness. It used to be just about has the patient's condition changed or not, but now they're focusing more on treatment, which is a really big change.
So even if the condition hasn't necessarily gotten worse, but they're not meeting those treatment targets, that's considered less stable. Interesting.
Exactly. It recognizes that just managing a chronic illness can be really complex. So those treatment goals are a really big deal now.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're starting to get into it. MDM is the big thing, but this worksheet, it breaks it down into these different sections. So let's get into the weeds a little bit here. Let's talk about data. What's new in the data section?
So the data section is all about the information that a provider uses to make these medical decisions. And it's not just about ordering tests, although that's definitely part of it. We're talking about things like reviewing external notes or even getting a patient's history from an independent source. These all matter for MDM now.
Hey, hold up. Independent historian, that's a new one. What does that even mean?
So that's a really big change, especially for certain patients. Let's say you have an elderly patient and they have dementia. They might not be able to accurately remember their medical history or symptoms. So getting information from a family member or a caregiver, that begins crucial, and this guideline's recognizing that.
Oh, so it's recognizing those real-world situations where you might not get the full story just from the patient themselves. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so moving right along on our little MDM adventure here, we've got risk. And I feel like assessing risk, that's always been part of medicine, right? So what's different?
Exactly. Now, yeah, so you're right. Risk assessment. That's Medicine 101. What's different is how these guidelines define how risk impacts EM coding. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the worksheet, it actually mentions social determinants of health as factors in risk assessment.
Hold on, social determinants of health?
Yeah.
I never thought about that being a part of medical coding. Yeah, how does that even work?
So it's all about recognizing how things a patient's economic situation, their access to healthcare, even food insecurity. These things can all impact their health and the kind of care they need.
Okay. So it's like a much bigger picture of risk than we might have thought about before, but how do those social factors actually play into the medical decisions being made? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so let's say you have a patient who is experiencing housing insecurity. That one factor can impact so many things, like their ability to follow a treatment plan, to manage their medications, even just to make it to
Appointments, right. It's like a whole other layer of things to consider.
Exactly. And I think this new emphasis on social determinants of health, it's really acknowledging that those factors, they can really bump up the level of decision-making that's needed from providers.
That's really interesting. It's like these guidelines are catching up to the real world of how medicine actually works. Okay, so we've talked about MDM, how it's becoming like the main event here and how it's considering all these different factors now. But obviously, like the time a provider spends with a patient, that's still important.
Yeah.
Right. So what about the changes to time-based coding? That's still an option in. The worksheet, right?
Yeah, for sure, because sometimes, it's not about the complexity of the medical decision. Sometimes it's just about how much time a provider spends with a patient, really listening to their concerns, addressing their questions.
Right. Like when you have that patient with a mile-long list of stuff going on and they really need that extra time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when is it okay to use that time-based coding? And how does that work with these new MDM levels?
So the worksheet actually has these really helpful tables that lay it all out. But basically, it's like this. If the time that a provider spends with a patient, if it goes way beyond what's typical for an MDM level, then you can use time as the main thing to decide the code.
Okay, that makes sense. But I did hear something about the definition of prolonged time changing. Yeah, what's that all about?
You heard right. There has been a little tweak there. So it used to be that any extra time you spent with a patient beyond what was typical for a basic EM code that could be tacked on as prolonged time. But now it has to be a full 15 minutes past the highest level of service for that encounter.
So like a quick 5-minute chat after an exam that doesn't really count towards prolonged time anymore.
Yeah, you got it?
Interesting.
Those little chunks of time, they don't add up the same way anymore, okay? It's about those longer stretches of time, the ones that go above and beyond.
So it's kind of making that time component a little bit stricter. Wow, there's a lot here, I'm telling you. They really thought this through.
It is.
A lot too. Unpack it is so for our listeners out there who are maybe just tuning in. What would you say are the absolute need-to-know takeaways here if they only remember a couple of things from this deep dive? What should it be?
I'd say the biggest thing is at MDM. It's like the driving force behind EM coding now. So really understanding how these guidelines define complexity, risk data analysis, those are key for anybody who deals with medical billing and coding.
Yeah. And we can't forget about those little changes to time-based coding, like those 15-minute increments. Those are important to remember. I'm starting to see why this new worksheet is the holy grail. I mean, having something like this to help make sense of all the little details is huge for providers and coders. Totally. So speaking of navigating these new guidelines, are there any pitfalls you can think of, things that providers should watch out for that might trip them up with these changes?
That's a good question. One thing that comes to mind is the potential for downcoding, because with MDM being so important now, providers really need to make sure they're documenting the complexity of everything, like all their decisions. Otherwise, they could end up undervaluing their services, and that means lower reimbursements.
That's a good point. So it's not just about understanding the new codes, it's also about making sure your documentation is up to par.
Exactly, you gotta
be on top of it. Wow, this has been so helpful. So to wrap things up for our listeners, what's the one thing they should do to get ready for these 2024 changes?
Honestly, just dive into that AAP worksheet. It's like your coding Bible now. Don't just skim it, really. Spend some time with it. Make sure you understand all those little details and examples, and think about how it all applies to what you do.
I love it. Knowledge is power, as they say. Real. Well, a huge thank you to our expert for walking us through all of this. That was a true deep dive. And for our listeners, we will be sure to link that AAPC worksheet in our show notes. So don't worry, you'll be able to find it. Until next time. Everyone stay curious and keep those questions coming. We'll see you on our next deep dive